Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for our last screencast of the year. So our topic for today, it's really, we're just kind of looking at a time period here. We're looking from 1990 to 2001, and some of the big domestic things that are happening. So you want to keep in mind we're spanning really three presidencies here, but really two major ones. So we're talking about really the Clinton years, 1992 to 2000, and then the Bush years, 2000 to. We're not really going to go fully into George Bush. We'll finish that after the exam. We're just going to kind of talk about some of the domestic stuff related to September 11th. So what we're going to start with is really some big things that are happening under Bill Clinton. So again, we'll get into Bill Clinton a little bit more after the exam. But what I think is one of the biggest things to know about Bill Clinton is things that are happening economically under his presidency. So we have a lot of job growth in the 1990s, and a lot of it's attributed to a growing, they call it a dot-com boom or a tech boom that's happening in the country. So this is really like the beginning of the internet really catching on and a lot of technology companies catching on. So you see innovations in technology, the internet, and the area where a lot of these companies are going to prosper and to grow is Silicon Valley, which is out in California. So a lot of the companies that you guys are familiar with, like Yahoo, Google, uh, Apple, their companies, Amazon, are going to really start to take off in the 1990s. And so our economy is kind of shifting into a more technology-based economy, and there's a lot of job growth. So overall, the economy is doing pretty well. This is not really like they don't really call it the Roaring '90s like they call it the Roaring '20s, but I think there's a nice correlation here, and just the fact that the economy is growing, job creation is growing, in the 1990s. You do see uh, kind of overall improvement of the economy. One of the other things that Bill Clinton is able to do in his presidency, he's able to balance the budget. So he's the first president to balance the budget at that point in years, and so he was able to eliminate the deficit. Now, that doesn't mean that he was able to start to pay off our debt. He didn't pay off our debt really, or even come close to paying off our debt, but he did kind of get the country back to a balanced budget. So the economy, most people consider the economy doing well in the 90s. The stock market grows in the 90s. Now, later on in the 2000s, if you can see here, this is one of our worst decades in history as far as the economy is concerned. 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There's some decent job growth in all of these time periods. I mean, we talked about the 70s having some trouble, but the 80s and 90s, the economy is doing pretty well. 2000s, like the era that you're born, and you're born into, is a really tough economic time period, and since then we've kind of bounced back a little bit. Now, the election of 2000 is really going to be a divisive election. It's one of the closest elections in the history of the country. And so you have two candidates running for the presidency. You have George Bush Jr., who is the Republican candidate, and you have Al Gore, who's the Democratic candidate. Now, when you look at this electoral map, it's a little bit deceiving because you can't really see the numbers of how much each state is worth. Uh, but it's a super close race. And what makes it even closer is that we don't know who won the presidency on the night of the election. So November 7th, 2000 is the election. They tally up the votes, and it's so close that we still don't know who won the election the next morning. So the state that's in contention is Florida, okay? And whoever is going to win Florida is going to win the election, is going to win the presidency. Uh, Now, the problem here in Florida is that they had a major malfunction with their voting booths. They had like these punch cards that they use for voting, and they malfunctioned during the election. And so they actually had to go back and count and recount certain counties by hand, and this took months. So we really didn't know who the president was for about a month, 2 months after the election took place. Now, the only other election I could think of in American history that was similar to this one is the election of 1876, which we talked about when Tilden runs against Hayes, and eventually they make a kind of like a backroom deal that they call the Compromise of 1877, and Hayes gets the presidency, and Tilden gives it up in order to to return to, he calls it home rule in the South, and he wants basically Reconstruction to end. That was a very similar election because it's super close election. What makes it even more contentious, so eventually George Bush is able to win. He wins Florida and he wins the presidency. What makes it even more contentious is the fact that Al Gore won more popular vote than George Bush. So some of you guys may be thinking to yourself, how is that possible? Again, there's a precedent for this in American history. This has happened before in American history. But how it can happen is within each state. Let's take Texas, for example. How our system works is it's a popular vote within each state. So if you win the popular vote in Texas, you win the electoral votes from Texas. If you win the popular vote in Oklahoma, you win the popular vote in Oklahoma. Now, each state is kind of an independent popular vote. So the name of the game here to be the president is to win over 270 electoral votes. So what actually ends up happening is that Al Gore wins more popular votes overall if you took the overall population of the country, but he ends up losing the election because he loses more states and he loses more electoral votes to George Bush. So that's something that a lot of people I think might be confused about, but that can happen in American history. It can happen, and it can happen in the future where somebody wins more popular votes, but they lose more electoral votes and they lose the election, and that's exactly what happened here. Now, Gore is upset about this whole recount situation, and so there's actually a Supreme Court case, Gore versus Bush, that goes to the Supreme Court. And actually, this is the first only time in history that the Supreme Court weighs in on a presidential election. And so they uphold kind of the recount, and they uphold George Bush being the president of the United States. And so this is kind of how Bush takes office. So it's pretty contentious right from the start with George Bush coming into office. Now, the major event that dominates George Bush's entire presidency, as we know, is September 11th, really, and the aftermath of September 11th, which is the War on Terror. Now, domestically, there's also a war on terror domestically. And the cornerstone legislation of the war on terror domestically is going to be the Patriot Act, which is passed in the aftermath of September 11th in 2001. Now, the Patriot Act gives the federal government extended power, extended search and seizure power, extended surveillance power over the American people. Some things that they're allowed to do under the Patriot Act is they're allowed to tap in and listen to people's phone calls, to search records, your internet search history records, your library records, and they're going to deem this necessary because of September 11th and trying to capture terrorists and terrorist organizations and to stop further plots. And Congress passed this. This is not George Bush who just kind of like dictates this. This is an act passed by Congress. And it's upheld by the Obama administration when he comes into office. So it's something that's been extended, and it's something that you guys live under. So it's increased surveillance, increased ability to look into your personal history and to look into your personal accounts to try and combat terrorism. As you can see from this cartoon, there's quite a bit of criticism of the Patriot Act. People feel like it's stomping on your civil liberties, on your First Amendment rights, on your Bill of Rights, and things that are guaranteed to you in the Constitution. The other thing that's going on here is that they're going to use this Patriot Act to try and find terrorists and suspected terrorists. They can detain people, without giving them a reason for being detained. So I can see similarities, and hopefully you can, in American history. This is similar to early in American history when we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams. It's also similar during World War I when they passed similar acts, to try and curtail. They're afraid of German spies in the country, and so it's limiting your rights, but it's limiting your rights because they feel a need for safety, and that's kind of the essence of the Patriot Act. Now, the other thing that's going on domestically is you do see strains of Islamophobia going on in the country, and you still kind of hear some of that now because we're still dealing with this post 9/11 world and terrorism and kind of the reactions to terrorism within the country. All right, so that was kind of a short, brief overview of the 1990s and the early 2000s. After the AP test, we'll go into some more detail, but I just wanted to make sure that you guys had a background in it. try and be able to draw comparisons to other parts of American history. That's one of the keys to the test, especially with this modern stuff. This is good stuff. You can draw comparisons, even if there's no essay questions on these. You can draw comparisons between the 20s and the 90s if you want, or other booming economic time periods, or technology, or like the Patriot Act is great outside information to throw in. So even if they don't ask about this stuff directly, this background knowledge, this knowledge of modern America, can help you to add some extra stuff into your essays. All right, so we'll start reviews, go over some tips on Monday in class. Hopefully your studying is going well, and I'll see you guys on Monday.